Welcome everybody to this here new episode of Contemplate or Your Life. Well, last time we considered one of Immanuel Kant's questions. We considered the question, what can we know? And this week let's delve into the next one, which is what should we do? And to my mind, these two questions are quite closely connected. What we can know in our reality is basically determined by what we can do. Our vision, our worldview, what we perceive, is guided by action, quite directly. But when we try to formulate some sort of rule as to how we should act, it's quite obvious that usually in our history we've found those answers in religion. So if there's a God that has some sort of law that you should abide by, well, if you transgress that law, of course there's a God who sees it and can punish you for it. Within philosophy, we don't have that sort of thing, obviously. So if a philosopher like Plato writes a book on how you should act, and you don't do it, you don't follow his rules, so what's he gonna do? Get up from his grave and punish you for it? He won't. So when we ask the question, what should we do? We could be philosophical about it, but I think there's a limit to what philosophy can achieve here. Let's first delve into some problems that are connected to this issue within philosophy. First, let's consider the is-ought gap, clearly defined by philosopher David Hume. David Hume was an empiricist, which means that in his quest for knowledge, he says you should always keep in mind that it should be empirical, meaning you should be able to perceive it. Alright, so Hume said, from that perspective, while we can never, in this reality, we can perceive how things are, but we can never perceive how they should be. So the famous is-ought distinction tells us that never we can, by looking at the world, by gaining knowledge there, we can never actually gain some information on how we should act. And this is basically been granted by a lot of philosophers, but is David Hume right here? Is our morality strictly, shouldn't adhere to strict empirical rules? Maybe not, maybe there's more to it. Another problem in philosophy is of course free will. If we ask how you should act, then we sort of presume that you are the master of your actions, that we can hold you accountable for it. So if you act in a certain way, and if we presume free will, we are also presuming that maybe you could have acted differently. So apparently there's a different world with different possibilities. And even when we look at where your actions come from, where your thoughts come from, then it's not clear that there's an author behind our thoughts, is there? So let's do this famous thought experiment here. And this is a version with cities that I know from the philosopher Sam Harris, but I think it's a very good example. So if you were to choose any city, you could pick any city that you like. Think about it for a second. Anywhere in the world. No right or wrong answers here. So if you pick a city, let's say you have one, and let's say you've picked Tokyo. Could you have chosen a different city? Well, you can quite directly look at your train of thought here. And I first asked you to do this. What popped into your mind? Well, first, let's consider that all the cities that you've never heard of, let's say you've never heard of Kinshasa, so you were not free to choose Kinshasa here. And if we go a step further, were you free to choose the cities that simply did not come to mind? Maybe Barcelona didn't come to mind. Well, you absolutely know that is a city. Maybe you even visited it, but it just didn't pop into your mind at that specific moment. So are you really free in that respect? Well, a lot of philosophers seem to agree that you're not free in that respect. So in a sense, that also is throwing out a lot of morality here, because if you're not accountable for your actions, is there any use in speaking of the right actions versus the wrong ones? And I think there is. And to find some evidence in that, we could look at nature. This is one of Skinner's famous pigeons. And And these pigeons were randomly fed a grain of rice. Some hatch would open at a random moment and there a grain of rice would pop out. And the pigeon would reiterate the behavior that he was showing right before that moment. So he was making some sort of connection. If I just only do this, and I repeat it, maybe more grain will pop out. So we see in nature also this really direct connection between our actions and the world. And maybe to some extent it's overrated, like in this instance we could call it magical thinking. The pigeon thinks he has more agency in the world than he actually does. Nevertheless, we see in our world always examples of behavior. If you look around you, if you look at successful people, you would want to understand why they are successful. And you look at their behaviors and you might want to copy their behaviors. So if you say you link between someone being really productive or creative or something like that and being quite successful, well, then it's an example you want to follow. So you really do see the link directly between actions and their consequences. So I think reality is always ripe with morality. And we've got that obviously in our cultures. So let's, instead of looking for hard philosophical evidence, let's look at the foundations of our culture that we find obviously in stories. Well, one of the oldest stories that we know of course, is the story of Adam and Eve. And this story basically is about being aware of good and evil. So Adam and Eve were in paradise, where they had no awareness of good and evil. And they were allowed to eat anything they wanted, except obviously for the tree that contained the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. And obviously they transgressed that law immediately. And then they were aware of good and evil, and they were expelled. So let's look at this from a metaphorical standpoint. If we try to look at good and evil in nature, let's say. If a lion chases a gazelle, is he evil? I think no one would argue that. If he chases the gazelle and kills it and eats it, no, he's not evil. And if the lion is walking around and he sees some cubs that aren't his, and he kills them, well, that's a bit more gruesome, isn't it? But nevertheless, we couldn't easily say that it's evil. But if I would do that as a human, just go around and killing babies that aren't mine, people wouldn't appreciate it that much, I would assume. So there's something happening here with our development as a species. At a certain point we had this knowledge of good and evil, and we know that we couldn't transgress certain laws. Well, what happens after this? Their children, Cain and Abel. And there's something to be said that these actually are the first people, real people, because they were born out of a woman. And Adam and Eve were not. So Abel is bringing a sacrifice to God. Cain is doing it as well. But Abel's sacrifice is being accepted, and Cain's is not. So Cain is pretty pissed off about that, and he kills his brother. And this is just a marvelous story in the Bible. Only like 10 lines in the Bible, but there's so much wisdom to it. In the sense that, once you have this knowledge of good and evil, there's also a lot of that you don't know. Why was his offer not accepted? He doesn't know. Fate is capricious in that sense. God is capricious. So you can't really think it through. What is the chain of action that caused this offer being rejected? And he goes into the path of resentment. And this is also something that this story tells us. Fate can be harsh on you, even and you don't know why. But don't be resentful about it. So let's go to the story of Jesus then. You should carry the sins upon you. And Jesus is doing that for everybody in the story. So thank you for that. But of course, it's quite a powerful metaphor as well. You should recognize evil and sin and recognize it within yourself. Like Hume would say, integrate the shadow. And that's one of the interpretations of the story of Jesus and what it's telling us. And even if those are the foundational stories on which our culture is built, and also on which our own self-image is built, because the self is basically a story. It's a narrative. It's got a narrative structure. So let's look at some other great narratives from our culture, more recent narratives. Let's look at Luke Skywalker, let's say. There's going to be some spoilers in this next part, obviously, because I have to talk about the content of the story here. So Luke has to confront the fact that this badass Darth Vader is his own father. And he has also has to confront that fact within himself, this evil presence in him, which in Star Wars is called the dark side of the Force. So he has to learn this dark side within him before he can really defeat Darth Vader. This is the old trilogy. I'm not even acquainted with the new one, but this is one of the great stories that I grew up with, let's say. Another one is, of course, Frodo from Lord of the Rings. He carries this burden. He has to bring back the ring to Mount Doom. And this ring is corrupting everybody. And everybody wants power, and everybody goes mad over it. So Frodo, really has to connect to that evil within himself before he can do that. And that's what this whole journey is about as well. Last example here, Harry Potter. Harry is quite special in this world because as a child he was touched by Voldemort. Voldemort, this ugly badass here, killed his parents and tried to kill Harry as well, while doing so. So, because Harry was touched, he has, let's say, a trail of this evil within him. So he has to confront that, and that's why he's the only one to defeat Voldemort. Last example here would be from the Godfather trilogy. Michael is a mobster, and if you're the boss of a crime family, obviously you've got some blood on your hands, and that's what this story is about for a big part. And at a certain point, he knows that he's being betrayed by his own brother. And then he has a difficult decision to make, obviously. But he takes the difficult decision. He kills his own brother. And that could be considered quite evil, couldn't it? And of course, this trope goes back to the archetypical brother story that we just saw in Cain and Abel. So Michael Corleone really has to confront that evil within him as well. And at the end, in part 3, there's a different twist to that, obviously. Alright, so thank you for watching this episode of Contemplate or Your Life, and I'll see you in the next one.